What's up, everybody? Welcome back. I hope that you're having a nice evening. Hope that you're settling in, that you're not too anxious or stressed out. Hopefully, you're at home and comfortable and ready to re engage, as always, in a very exciting discussion about democratization. Before we get started, I just want to talk for a moment about some changes that I made to the syllabus. I went ahead and sent you the file in the chat, and you can download it from there, the revised syllabus. You can also find it on Cat Courses. You'll find that I didn't make many changes at all. We just changed some of the dates and some of the, well, just the dates really. None of the readings changed with one exception. I want to bring your attention to this week. I went ahead and shifted the Constitution building section of the course to this week because we were about a week behind. And I want you to complete this reading, the Norris book, chapter 1, and then the Wayhue piece as well. Next week, we only meet on Monday because Wednesday is a non-instructional day. Before I had us meeting on Wednesday, we won't meet on Wednesday. Instead, we'll meet for just Monday, and we'll discuss electoral integrity, and you'll complete the chapter 5 reading from the Norris book for Monday. Now, previously I had you also doing a reading called Why Elections Fail by Norris. I wasn't able to obtain that because of access issues. The long story short is I don't have a library card because I've never physically been to Merced. I was just hired for this year. Everything's online. And so I wasn't actually able to use interlibrary loan resources. Anyway, it's not a big deal because we're only meeting on Monday and it would be too much to give you 2 readings anyway. And so the chapter 5 reading should be sufficient. I think that we could cover everything that we need with just that reading. And then on November 30th, we will cover gender equality and women's empowerment, and we'll do readings by Norris and Engelhardt and Crook. And then on December 7th and December 9th, we'll cover executive powers under 3 different types of democratic systems: presidential, mixed, and prime ministerial. I did change the due date for the final paper, the term paper, to December 11th. There have been some changes on the ground, and I want to give you as much time as possible to complete the paper. I also intend to have the short papers back to you with feedback, with plenty of time to spare. Now, as a reminder, we did line up a reader for this class, and I'm already working with that reader. And so the wheels are beginning to turn, and I want to thank you again, everyone, for being patient while we kind of patch things together under COVID. As a reminder, we were supposed to have a teaching assistant for this course. And that was both to help me with the grading that I can't do alone. And that was to also give you more contact with the instructors for the course. And I regret that we don't have that TA and that you don't have that contact and that I don't have that support. But we do now have a reader. And so I anticipate that in short order, we should be able to get these things moving, and I should be able to get this stuff back to you. But I do anticipate that you'll want to finish that paper by December 11th. I've been very flexible with due dates because of how circumstantial everything is and how challenging these circumstances are. But I do insist that you turn that in on time. Now, the final exam, for whatever reason, the registrar's office did not assign this course a final exam slot. I don't know why. I'm trying to find out when we should take the exam, and I'm in contact with the university, kind of waiting on a response. So thank you for being patient with me on that. I have no idea why we don't have an exam time set aside, but for whatever reason, we don't. And so I'm figuring that out. If you have any comments or questions about what we have left in the course, I'd love to hear from you. This is a time where we can review these things. And so do any of you have any comments or questions? No, there will be a final, Arturo. It's just that I'm trying to figure out when we'll be taking that and when it should be scheduled according to the registrar. Nothing is due on December 3rd, Cynthia. The final paper is due on December 11th.
Okay, because I was checking on the syllabus and it says the ideal template is a research article published by peer-reviewed scholarly journal, and it said it was due December 3rd. I was wondering what that was.
Yeah, so I've gone ahead and updated the syllabus, although that's supposed to say December 3rd. Sorry. Or it's December 11th. My bad. I thought I changed that. Maybe I didn't. Anyway, it's due December 11th, everyone. And so you'll see that clearly on the course schedule. And so don't worry about the 3rd. That's a hangover from an earlier syllabus. Any other questions or comments? Okay, so let's go ahead and begin our new unit, which is the key principles of constitution building. The way we're going to address this topic of constitution building is by focusing on the problem of constitution building in deeply divided societies. And what this basically means is we'll be talking about what are the key principles of building a democracy in a society that is racially and ethnically and linguistically and religiously diverse, and where the divisions between these different groups are deep and well established. Now, a society like this presents a number of challenges because, as you'll see, it's difficult to get all of the players to accept the democratic rules of the game when they have deep-seated hostilities or they have grievances that go back far in time. And then the question becomes, how do you set up a system that can satisfy those different actors so that democracy can be achieved and consolidated in a place like this? And so this discussion has us talking a lot about countries in, for example, Africa or the Middle East. It has us talking about countries that have experiences very different from the experiences of Western European or North American countries like the United States or Canada. And so what we're really going to be talking about is constitution building in new democracies in Africa and elsewhere in the world, where societies are deeply divided by these different categories that I identified. Our starting point for today is pointing out an important issue with democracy. And you might also already be thinking, well, what is the issue with democracy? Well, the issue with democracy is that democracy is about inclusion, but also exclusion. So think about voting in a presidential or a legislative election in the US, for example. If you go and you vote for your congressperson, there's only one person who wins that election. And the winner of that election in your district takes the whole constituency. It doesn't matter how many votes the second place candidate got, that party and that candidate are excluded. We have a majoritarian system, and this system is as much about inclusion as it is about exclusion. But the problem with deeply divided societies where there are well-established divisions between ethnic or religious groups is that there's always the risk of permanent exclusion. That is to say that some groups will be forced out of the process and may be permanently forced out. There's also the problem of historical memory, the idea that as the future is being planned, the past intrudes with increasing severity, the idea that we can't necessarily forget what has taken place, we can't necessarily forgive what has taken place. All of these factors make it difficult in a divided society to agree or to accept the rules or to accept the authority of some other group who might find themselves in government. And Horowitz, who said much of what we've already discussed, had this to say about all of the above. Many institutions are compatible with democracy in the abstract, but not all of them are conducive to multi-ethnic inclusiveness. And so when we're talking about a deeply divided society, we might talk about the example of the Central African Republic, where there are as many as 11 groups who can be represented in any political body at a given time because of the density of all of these different groups. You've got everyone from the Bandas to the Bantu to the Sara to the Northern group to the Pygmies and everyone in between. Remember that in Africa as well as in Latin America, borders were drawn by colonial powers without regard for uniformity or population or racial or ethnic or linguistic or religious differences. And so as a result, African countries and Latin American countries as well often look something like this. In African countries, the divisions are often tribal. In Latin American countries, they often relate to geography or differences between indigenous and non-indigenous people. But the arbitrary way that borders are drawn in many places in the developing world means that many countries have the challenge of overcoming deep divisions between different groups. Sierra Leone is a different example from the African continent, where you find a number of different groups, all relatively evenly represented. The challenge of developing and consolidating democracy in a society like this is that the divisions between these different groups are very, very deep. And the grievances between them are sometimes very, very accentuated as well. And getting those groups to work together or to accept the authority or the rule of another is often a serious challenge. Religious groups in Lebanon are also very, very numerous. And again, we have this kind of splintering where no group easily dominates any of the others. Lebanon is a multi-ethnic, a multi-religious society. If ever there was one, these divisions present a lot of challenges for democracy because of those well-established differences between the groups and because of the very, very timeless nature of the differences in many respects. If you look at the different proportions of the ethnic groups and religious groups in Lebanon, you'll find that not only are there numerous religions, but that each of the different groups in many cases are relatively evenly proportioned. And so no group has a clear advantage. It's a deeply divided society in the sense that Sunnis, Shias, Maronite Christians, Greek Orthodox, Druze, Greek Catholics, and other Christians are all relatively evenly distributed. And those that are smaller find themselves in the company of other smaller groups, just as those that are larger find themselves in the company of other larger groups as well. These differences are very well established, and what's notable is that no group has a clear advantage. We've already talked in the class about election violence in Kenya in 2007. This was inter-ethnic and intercommunal violence. This was violence that was basically sort of brought about by elites from a particular community who did not accept the election outcome because of the defeat of their candidate and the victory of the candidate of an opposing group. And what followed was bloody post-election violence where members of different groups went after each other. And the end result was a high number of deaths and a lot of disorder and chaos and violence, and really an event that threw into jeopardy the future of democracy in Kenya. Ethiopia is another country in Africa that's been characterized by extensive ethnic fractionalization, extensive divisions between different ethnic or tribal groups who are all relatively evenly represented or sort of proportioned, if you will, and could all represent a relatively equal challenger politically to any of the other groups. Now, the reason that I'm giving you all of these examples is because I want to highlight how divided some societies are. And I want to show you what democracy has to contend with or what democracy has to cope with in these kinds of situations. And the first question that we arrive at is, how do you make democracy work in a divided society like this, where there is a risk of permanent exclusion, where there's a risk of grievances or conflict, where there's a risk of election violence, where there's the possibility that some groups might not accept the outcome, How do you make democracy work in a situation like this? Let's discuss this. What do you think?
Well, I think you have to ensure that minority interests are protected, and that usually means either some sort of proportional representation, and or in the case of Lebanon, where I believe they have the prime minister, the president, and the speaker of the house from the three largest religious groups, so that no one setup gains extra power in the government. So there has to be some sort of institutional mechanism like that, or power sharing, or whatever institutional makeup there is that allows for protection of minority interests.
Okay, so maybe we could create institutions or arrangements that help to protect minorities so that they're not permanently excluded. Okay, what else could we do, or what else comes to mind?
I think one of the things that can be done is like know that there's like the issue, but also like don't dismiss it, like don't dismiss it like completely, but like know that the issue is there and try to work with it in the sense of like work with the people who have the issue and make sure that their needs are fulfilled, but don't disregard other people's needs just because one set of group has their needs haven't been fulfilled. So also like we also have to consider that you have to like do two things for two different type of people.
Okay, so this is a really good point because democracy is kind of like, you want to let the majority rule, right? But at the same time, you need to protect the minority enough or sufficiently. And when I say enough, what I mean is like enough so that they still play ball, right? So that they don't lose faith in democracy and withhold their support or choose not to vote or choose not to participate. You need to protect their interests if they're not in the minority so that they'll continue to support the system and come back for another round so that we can all continue to benefit from the democratic system as a whole. But at the same time, we can't let the minority overrule the majority, right? So like we still have to make sure that the majority is able to get what it wants because ultimately it was that majority who won the election. And so what's interesting about this discussion, everyone, is we begin to discover that democracy is sort of not a perfect solution, right? Like, yeah, we have seen for ourselves over and over that democracy is preferable to dictatorship. But democracy still has some limitations in the sense that in a country like Kenya, for instance, democracy can produce a very violent outcome if the minority doesn't feel as though the election produced a fair outcome, or if they're willing to take up arms against the majority or the winner of the election if that winner comes from a different group. How do you produce a system or a democratic system that doesn't fall prey to these kinds of limitations or these weaknesses? And I would suggest to you that in this country right now, we're also witnessing this sort of dissatisfaction of the loser of the election. 4 years ago, when Donald Trump won the presidency, there was a lot of dissatisfaction among Democrats who felt as though the election may not have produced a desirable or an effective outcome. This year, after the defeat of Donald Trump in the election, there's a lot of dissatisfaction among Republicans who feel as though the election may not have produced an effective outcome. In both instances, in both 2016 and 2020, the loser appears to be dissatisfied with the outcome. In both cases, that loser, at least in terms of the Electoral College, represents the minority. Now, in 2016 and 2020, Democrats voted or at least the Democratic candidate won more popular votes. But in terms of our institutions, the Electoral College, both years, 2016 and 2020, the minority was dissatisfied with the election outcome. And so you can see then how democracy does elevate the majority, but also carries the risk of maybe leaving the minority dissatisfied with the outcome. Now imagine how serious and grave the situation must be in societies that have much deeper divisions, that are ethnic and linguistic and religious and racial in some cases, and group and tribe-based. Those societies are dealing with much more fundamental challenges that relate to the very essence of the system and how to make a democracy work when the players are already inclined to dismiss or disregard the victor if the victor doesn't come from their group. Now, before we continue, let's continue to discuss this. How do we make democracy work in a divided society? Apart from power sharing, apart from protecting the minority, what else can we do in a country like Sierra Leone or Lebanon to make democracy work?
I think it's also seeing what the groups are willing to compromise on. For example, like if one group wants to do whatever religious practices they want, then okay, that's fine, but you have to respect the other group that wants to do the same thing as you.
I see. So there's sort of a role for like figuring out what the limits are. Like, what are the limits of autonomy? And then the question arises, like, how do you accommodate those individual groups who might have different religious systems or belief systems and who might want to impose that on other groups? How do you get them to go along with a democratic society and set of rules without letting them overrule other groups and without risking them going away and withholding their support for democracy? And so these are some of the classic questions, right? Like, make compromises, but also protect the rights of other groups in this system that you set up. Arturo says, quota-based elections, we're getting closer here. And I'm happy to see that you're already discussing some of the ideas and the themes that come from the reading about consociationalism and about power sharing. Everything that we've talked about so far is on point. And I'm happy to see that we're already appreciating some of the challenges associated with democratization in these kinds of societies. And what I want to tell you up front is that majoritarianism does not work in these situations. The winner of the most votes takes the whole constituency and no one else gets a seat. That does not work in this kind of a situation. You can't have a system where the second place finisher gets no representation at all, despite how many votes they received. You have to set up a system of power sharing or a system of consociationalism in a divided society for democracy to work. You've got to set up a system that is more proportional and that incorporates elites from multiple different groups in the policy process. You've got to replace majoritarian institutions with their winner-take-all sensibility with proportional representation institutions where seats are divided up according to the proportion of the vote received by different parties. More generally, you've got to put in place what we call a power sharing regime. Power sharing regime is a system which features formal institutional rules that give multiple political elites from different communal groups a stake in the decision-making process. These are basically systems of arrangements set up by the state that are designed to facilitate cooperation between different groups. So think about what this means. This means a system that begins with the assumption and is premised on the idea that there are these different groups who are already in conflict. They are at odds with one another. We must set up a system that brings them together peacefully and cooperatively and channels them into arrangements that can help to produce stable, predictable outcomes for democracy. Now, this is one of the bigger challenges democracy has ever faced, because this begins with the idea that, look, some democracies, some societies are set up to fail because they might have these deep divisions and these deep grievances between groups that might help to or work together to bring the society to collapse if those groups cannot work together. In this case, democracy serves to try to mitigate some of those divisions. And when we look out at the world, we find that there are some examples of successful consociationalism. Those include the Netherlands, Belgium, Austria, Switzerland, Lebanon, Malaysia, Colombia. But there are also a lot of examples of failed consociationalism, and Lebanon is in that group as well, for reasons that we'll discuss later. Consociationalism is difficult. It's hard to set up systems that bring about these kinds of outcomes, these stable, peaceful, cooperative outcomes. We'll talk about why consociationalism sometimes fails, but before we get there, we'll talk about what these systems look like and under what sorts of circumstances they arise and what conditions make them work. When we talk about consociationalism, when we talk about power sharing, we're really talking about a few different types of institutions or arrangements that we would set up specifically for the purpose of trying to facilitate this cooperation. So those include grand coalition governments. This is where opposing political parties form a single coalition, and then they govern through that coalition. Cultural autonomy, which comes in the form of recognition of language, religion, and custom, allowing different communities and groups to sort of govern themselves in those areas. Proportionality, as opposed to majoritarianism. This means proportional or fair minority representation. It means that minority groups get the proportion of the seats that correspond to the proportion of the vote that they received in the election. Minority veto relates to power sharing in the executive, in how different groups can have seats that are set aside for them within the cabinet of the prime minister in a parliamentary system. And those different seats set up for different groups can be used to share power and can ultimately result in what we call a minority veto, where some group is able to prevent the creation of some bill or some project or some amendment. Federalism, which is the sort of segmentation of the state into different spatial units that grant political autonomy to different groups. Federalism usually goes hand in hand with cultural autonomy and setting up regions to facilitate different languages or religions or customs, schools, textbooks, all those things. So for example, in Spain, there are different regions of Spain, breakaway regions, that have been granted further and further autonomy over the years in an effort by the central government to sort of retain those units, but grant them more freedom to pursue custom and education the way they see fit. And then finally, quotas, or representation in society, courts, the police, the military. Sometimes quotas are used in legislatures. Quotas can be used in any institutional setting to try to guarantee some representation for individual groups. Now, when we look at this list, what type of institution do you think would be the most effective at promoting cooperation between different groups? Can we hear from someone who's yet to comment? Arturo says proportionality. So why is that important, Arturo? And this goes for anyone else too who wants to answer. Why is proportionality important?
I believe proportionality is important because when you're in a democracy, people can like tend to focus on the ones that are like the president, like the people like in Congress and in the House and stuff, and they don't recognize that there's a lot of minority people that need to be represented and like their things that they need, and not just like the middle class or the upper class.
Yeah, so as Italia points out, in a divided society, we have a majority and a minority, just like we do in any society after any election. But in any society, we have a tendency to focus on the majority because they won, right? But what about that minority? What if that minority is 49% and the majority is 51%? If we don't pay attention to that 49%, we're actually ignoring 49% of the society. And so proportionality becomes important because it gives that 49% a voice that is proportionate to their actual size, right? It doesn't give them the majority. It just gives them 49% of the representation compared to the 51% that the winning side gets. And so instead of just kind of throwing away their votes, we're giving them seats that are proportional to the actual percentage of the vote that they received. This becomes especially important in these divided societies because if one group wins the election and they win 51% of the vote, and one other group or multiple other groups are among the 49% who lost, well, those groups among the 49%, they need representation because they then risk being permanently excluded by that majority group who won that election. And so that proportional representation gets that set of minority groups seats in Congress or the parliament that they can then use to try to kind of check or limit the power of the majority. This becomes really, really important when minority-majority relationships can be so consequential, and that's the case in a divided society. And so, as Arturo points out, it gives everyone a voice. It's not based on majority rule. And I'll give you another example. As soon as Donald Trump lost this election, one of the quickest talking points was, well, he won 70 million votes. That's more than any incumbent has ever won. That's true. Well, there have been 18 million more people in the US since 2016. But the point that he makes is actually a good one, which is that, look, it may have been 74 million votes that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris won, but Donald Trump and Mike Pence won 70 million. What about that minority of 70 million? What about their representation? Under a consociational system, a proportional representation system, that 70 million would have representation, at least in the legislature, that's proportional to their percentage of the overall vote that they received, as opposed to not getting anything at all. And so minority-majority relations do matter, and proportional representation in the electoral system helps to mitigate the possibility that majority rule could result in permanent exclusion of the minority in a very divided society. Does anyone disagree that proportionality is the most important? Is there an important role for, say, grand coalition governments, or is there some other institution that you think is essential? Arturo says, if I may, for example, in the USA, we only have Democrat versus Republican. A proportional would create more parties that fit into a voter's choice, rather than having to choose just among two. Absolutely, Arturo. And if we had the kind of deeply divided society that we're talking about in this lecture, that proportional representation would become especially important because different groups in society would very likely have different political parties. And then it would be important for those different groups to have representation so that none of them was ever abused by some other majority or some other group that won power. And so proportional representation would become important. You'll see later in the course that quotas can become very important, especially in terms of the representation of women. We'll see that quotas have been effective in improving the representation of women. And in this sense, quotas can be used as a strategy in a consociational democracy if we're concerned about the relationships between groups and whether some groups might might cross the threshold, so to speak, that they would need to cross to get representation. Are quotas like affirmative action or different? I don't think affirmative action technically counts as a quota. I think affirmative action means that all qualified candidates or qualified candidates that are minorities should be considered. I don't think that there's usually a quota involved. Quotas mean like some percentage of the body should be a certain type of member or a member of a certain type of group. Like a literal share of the body should be representatives of X or Y group. And so that's different from affirmative action. Now, when we talk about consociationalism, when we talk about power sharing, it's really a top-down, two-stage process. So there's an important role for both elites as well as masses. And this is what makes consociationalism so interesting from the perspective of democratic theory. Because remember that so far in the course, we've talked about elite theories as well as sort of collective action theories. And we've talked about them in separate conversations. Elite theories focus on elites. Collective action theories focus on masses. But consociationalism envisions a role for both elites and masses. And so in the first stage of this process, elites share power in the executive. They form these coalitions, these grand coalitions, these coalition governments. They use minority veto and power sharing in the cabinet. The second stage is group leaders promote conciliation among their followers. And so while elites from the groups are sharing power in the executive, group leaders or seniors or people who can speak for the group and speak on behalf of the elites who represent the group in the cabinet go to the followers and say, we believe in these institutions and we're going to promote them and legitimate them and view them as legitimate. And we're going to participate in this process and we're going to be a part of democratic politics. And so what's interesting is that in new democracies, elites are very, very important, not just because they can potentially mobilize their supporters in good or bad ways, but also because they can help to contribute to the consolidation of the democracy through the sort of promotion of this kind of peace among their followers. This means then that it's a very delicate situation. In Kenya, for example, the election violence was sort of whipped up by elites who were dissatisfied with the outcome and weren't willing to accept the outcome because the winner of the election came from a different group. That means, though, that they can do the opposite and they can promote peace and they can promote conciliation. And so it is a two-step process. It's a two-stage process. John points out, I believe that Israel has a grand coalition of sorts because after 3 elections, they couldn't come up with a consensus. And then the pandemic started. Germany also has a grand coalition government. And most of Merkel's governments were grand coalitions, if I recall correctly. So I don't know enough about Germany. And I don't know, actually. I can't say. It's possible that they do. But I think that that would be news to me, actually, because my understanding was that Germany just has a parliamentary system and that they form coalitions after the election and they choose a prime minister. I don't know if they have well-known like ethnic or religious divisions. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know about Israel. I think you're right about Israel, but I could be mistaken. I don't know enough about those cases, but thank you, John, for sharing. Arturo says, why are elites now seen as celebrities? They serve the people at the will of the people, yet there are people wearing their merchandise. Well, you know, a cult is a little bit different than a political party, Arturo. And so I don't know if we can always predict which way these things will go, but I don't see anyone putting flags that say Biden and Harris on their trucks, unless they're doing it humorously to satirize something else. But fair point. Why are elites now seen as celebrities? I think to answer your question seriously, though, elites are important first of all societies have their elites, political, economic, social. It's how we constrain them and what kinds of institutions we create for them that makes the difference. And so elites become important because for bad or for good, they're the ones in charge of creating these institutions, and they're the ones in charge of really, controlling them and making them work or upholding them or changing them. And so we then put a lot of faith in what they do, and we have to periodically replace them because they sometimes run afoul and they don't stay above board, and we decide that we want to replace them. But they are important for the time being and for the time that they're there, because they're the ones in charge and we put them in charge. UL says, just a curiosity, but would federalism apply also to people seeking asylum, refugees, and immigrants who have lived in a nation more than their original country? UL, can you give me like an example? So like diasporas is probably what you're talking about. Like communities of people who have migrated and have formed a new community and who might have a claim to some autonomy. I mean, and theoretically, yeah, right? So, but realistically, like when we think about the example of India, India is an example of a country where the central government has carved out different provinces over the years as part of a strategy to appease separatist groups who demand more autonomy. Those separatist groups have usually been there for like ages, right? They trace their sort of origin to, yesteryear, centuries ago, and they often have a claim that is historical. And so in those cases, I think that their claims, the origin of their claims, precedes independence. In the case of, say, like diasporas from Latin America and the United States, first of all, I think that the community would have to be so large and so total in a given region that they would have effective control of a region in the first place. And I think that they'd have to have some political power too, speaking realistically. And so in the case of like Latin American diasporas in the US, well, the system hasn't been set up to represent them effectively in getting citizenship and voting. These traditional sources of political power are often difficult to obtain. And so I think the situations are a little bit different. I don't know if it applies completely. Arturo says, if I may, just curious, why are some people spreading rumors and believing that the elites are planning and making a new world order? I don't know. I think some people want to believe in conspiracies. In my opinion, it's already obvious that elites control the world, and what they're doing in plain sight is scary enough. And so why we have to make stuff up about what they're up to is beyond me. Reality is already sufficiently alarming, and much of reality is concealed from view. So I don't know why. I think that the stuff of politics and political economy is already scary enough. And so any talk about a new world order, I kind of find to be laughable. But this is consociationalism. This is the role for elites and masses when we talk about power sharing. But at this point, we should add a few caveats and point out that consociationalism, power sharing, it doesn't always work. And in fact, there is a relatively narrow set of circumstances under which it does work. And you might have noticed, for instance, that many of the examples of successful cases come from Western Europe. Now that's interesting because we know that the kinds of divisions in Western Europe are mostly linguistic, sometimes religious, which is the case in Germany, where there are lots of confessional divisions. They're not often tribal or ethnic. They don't often relate to these differences between groups that sometimes precede periods of independence. These are often linguistic differences, like French speakers and German speakers in France or Austria. And moreover, many of those countries in Western Europe are small. And in addition, they often have groups that are of relatively equal size, and there's often a low level of economic inequality in a place like Germany or Austria. Now, when we add up all these circumstances, you find that it's a pretty long list, a laundry list really, of conditions for success. It's actually true that consociationalism requires pretty specific circumstances to really succeed. And so let's just list them from 1 to 9 before we continue and take into consideration what has to be in place for power sharing to really work. First and foremost, there can't be a dominant majority, because a dominant majority would usually not consent to a system like this that would reduce their power. There's got to be relative economic equality, because high levels of inequality can aggravate differences and make it difficult for groups to cooperate when their differences primarily relate to ethnicity or linguistic profiles or religious confessional divisions. Inequality can be a sort of a cleavage, if you will, that can intersect with a lot of these differences and make it hard to cooperate. There's got to be a limited number of groups. If you have an unlimited number of groups, it's impossible to set up a system that facilitates all of their cooperation. The groups have to be roughly the same size. The country has to have a small population. There needs to be some external security threat that promotes internal unity. There needs to be overarching loyalty to the national sort of government and the idea of the nation. There needs to be a tradition of compromise and accommodation. And there needs to be a geographical concentration of communities that can lend itself to some kind of organization among them. This is a very, very long list, and it suggests that consociationalism might not work that well if any of these components are not in place. This should cause us to take a moment and pause and maybe wonder about how well the system might work in a place like the average African country, where there are often many, many groups, and the groups might vary in size, and where they might not have a custom of compromise or accommodation. Now, I've talked a lot about elections and how in cases like the Kenyan example, disputed elections can be a trigger for group violence. Consociationalism is often an antidote to crises that erupt after disputed elections. Power sharing arrangements, either temporary or long-term, can help to stabilize a system when some crisis has taken place and where groups have turned against each other. And so a good example actually comes from Afghanistan in 2014. And we'll watch a video here that puts this in perspective, and we'll come back here in a moment and discuss this.
Afghanistan's election commission announced a new president Sunday, ending months of tension with a power-sharing agreement between the two leading candidates.
The Afghan nation was waiting impatiently for this happy day. Today, you have witnessed Kabul markets were crowded and people were out with big hope. May Allah bless you all with success and prosperity so you can be in the service of the Afghan nation day and night.
The agreement comes 3 months after a disputed runoff threatened to plunge the country into turmoil. Ashraf Ghani Ahmadzai was named the winner, with opponent Abdullah Abdullah the chief executive. But the commission is yet to release the final result totals. Earlier, Abdullah's supporters had threatened to form a parallel government in his northern strongholds. But under the new unity agreement, he will share official duties with the new president and will be in charge of carrying out government policies. The White House released a statement welcoming the deal as an opportunity for increased stability, but many are urging its swift implementation.
The fact is, the uncertainty of the past few months have taken a toll on the country's economy, its governance, and its security.
For residents, many happy to see an end to the immediate political crisis, but uncertain what the future will bring. Maggie Mazzetti, Associated Press.
Okay, so in this example, what was the agreement, or what was the power sharing arrangement that was arrived at to resolve this disputed election and the crisis that followed. So what is the power sharing arrangement that is being used in this example? Any takers?
Wouldn't it be the Grand Coalition?
So it's not a grand coalition necessarily, but close, right? Close. To me, it looks like a minority veto because the resolution of the crisis came when the leaders of the two groups agreed that one would be the president and one would be the prime minister. They would share duties and they would govern the country together. And this agreement that they would govern together and that they would essentially share a veto, so to speak, this helped to kind of appease the followers of the one who initially lost the election and who said that the outcome of the election was tainted. So the original crisis was the losing side said, "Oh, we won't accept the outcome." The winner said, "Well, you must accept the outcome because we defeated you." When it became clear that a crisis was underfoot and that it could result in violence because of their claim that they would start up a parallel government, the winning side allowed the losing side to essentially form what is basically a grand coalition inside the executive. And together, the president and the prime minister would rule together, would represent the two opposing groups, and would together help to facilitate the sort of conciliation of the two sides. And so this was how the Afghan crisis of 2014 was resolved. This is just an example of how consociationalism and power sharing becomes relevant in the context of an election in a democracy, or at least a formal democracy, where elections can produce outcomes that are undesirable or unfavorable to one group or another. And this gives you a sense then of how this looks in real life and how they resolve these crises using power sharing. Now, when we talk about constitution building in a divided society, we talk about the democratic transition in that period where a new constitution is created in the run-up to founding elections. Remember that a democratic transition in the process of democratization always includes, at some stage in the process, the writing of a constitution, and this always precedes the founding elections. When we write that constitution in a divided society during a democratic transition, we have a number of choices. We have 5 choices in particular that bear on how consociational the resulting democracy will be. And we're going to discuss those one by one, beginning with the choice of the electoral system. And I want you to focus on the decisions and the options available to constitution builders at each stage in the process. And I want you to think about the trade-offs and about the pros and the cons of different institutional arrangements. Now, the first choice that we have as constitution writers in the midst of a democratic transition is the type of electoral system. And really, we have a choice between a proportional representation system where seats are distributed by the proportion of the vote received, or a majoritarian system where the party who gets the most votes wins. Now, a proportional representation system is better because it facilitates a fair representation of minority groups in the system. Remember that groups get the proportion of the seats that corresponds to the proportion of the vote that they won. So if they got 25% of the vote, they get 25% of the seats, even if they didn't, get more votes than the winning party or the party who won a majority or a plurality. The idea is proportional representation should help to facilitate the fair representation of all of those smaller groups who might otherwise be excluded if we choose a majoritarian system. Now, on the flip side, if we did choose a majoritarian system, that would exclude ethnic or religious minorities. So in the example of Lebanon, if we chose a majoritarian system, all of those smaller groups, the smaller sects or the smaller breakaway groups, they would be sort of overrun by whichever group or groups were able to form a majority large enough to win the election. And so a proportional representation system would help to overcome and avoid that problem. Now, the truth is that a proportional representation still has to have some threshold. And in most countries, like in Germany, for example, it's 5%. You've got to win more than 5% of the vote to get whatever proportion of the seats that corresponds to your proportion of the vote. So some minority groups might be so small that they can't cross the 5% threshold, in which case they might not get seats. And so even proportional systems might be limited in how proportional they can be, but it's hard to satisfy everyone, especially when there are many, many groups and there are many, many parties. So let's take a look at a couple different hypothetical examples. Now, this is an example of a majoritarian electoral system. We've got 10 districts, all of which have one seat. And notice that in all of these districts, the outcome of the election was the same. Party A won 60% of the vote. Party B won 40% of the vote. However, at the end of the election, Party A gets 10 seats. They get one seat from each district election. They take all the seats, in other words. Party B gets 0 seats. But does that make any sense? It seems like Party B got a sizable share of the vote. Maybe Party B should get a sizable share of the total representation in the system. But in a majoritarian system, they don't. This is why a majoritarian system is not good in a divided society, because it punishes the minority and it gives the whole constituency to the majority, even if the majority only wins a relatively narrow majority, all else being equal. You see then how over time that minority is really punished quite substantially, because in every single district, the minority, despite winning 40% of the vote, gets no representation. Now let's take a look at a PR system. A PR system is one large district with 10 seats. Same number of seats as the previous. It's just that we count up and allocate those seats differently. Party A still wins 60% of the vote. Party B wins 40% of the vote. In this type of a system, Party A gets 6 seats. Party B gets 4 seats. This is a proportional representation system that allocates seats according to the proportion of the vote received by each party. This system of allocating seats proportionally does a much better job protecting that minority that won 40% of the vote, because that minority gets a number of seats that corresponds to the percentage of the vote that they received. And so we still have the majority coming out on top and getting to rule the day. They still have the majority in the legislature. It's just that Party B has many more seats than they would have if it was a majoritarian system. So you can see how counting up and adding and allocating the seats differently makes a big, big difference to the representation of minorities. You can see how this becomes really important in a deeply divided society where a minority might not be able to win a majority, but still needs representation in order to prevent being permanently excluded from the democratic system. Now, when you look at these two types of systems, what would you rather live under? Would you rather live under a majoritarian system or a PR system? And I'd like to hear from some of you who have yet to comment. Arturo says a PR system. What about the rest of you all? Would you rather live in a PR system or a majoritarian system? Tyler says PR system for sure. Karen says majoritarian. Interesting. Diego says PR system. Tyler says, although there are pros and cons to both. Touche. Edwin says, if I was part of the majority, the majoritarian. Right? It kind of depends on where you stand, where you sit. Yeah. I can also see it depending too on like the number of parties, or how many parties you want to be in politics, or maybe what party you belong to. Cynthia agrees with Edwin. So, you know, if you're living in a divided society, this is obviously a pretty chilling scenario, right? Because the 40% group is just getting whacked just over and over. Look at these losses that accumulate. All those wasted votes, so to speak. But in a PR system, they at least get a share that is roughly proportional to the total share of the vote that they received. And to be clear, that still is a minority, and they still would probably be defeated by the majority in any legislative battle. But the whole point is that they have people at the table who could potentially, you know, use any maneuver or any kind of political action they saw fit to interrupt the process or defend that minority group if something happens that would be bad for the group, you know, in the legislature. John says PR, but for the most part, because it would probably mean reforming the executive. Yeah, touche. Arturo says majoritarian seems to be promoting gerrymandering. PR would, in a way, get rid of this, I think, as long as there is no voter suppression. Yeah, so I kind of think that voter suppression and gerrymandering are often, I think it's usually sort of independent of the type of electoral system. But I think that there would certainly be there would have to be a lot more gerrymandering done to effectively rig a system where there are more districts or more members per district. But I think that that's an interesting discussion. I hadn't thought about that. Okay, so let's move forward and consider some more concrete examples. This is an example of a majoritarian system. This is the distribution of seats in the US House of Representatives before the November 2018 midterm. Okay, at that time, the Republicans controlled the House, and it looked like this. It looked like a division between the Republican Party in the red and the Democratic Party in the blue. And you'll notice that this is a system where third parties had no representation. We have the two major parties, and that's it. There are no real minorities, so to speak, or at least in terms of small parties we might think of as being smaller players in the system. This is a majoritarian system that produces a very winner-take-all outcome where a couple major players dominate everything. Now, look at the Brazilian Congress and the distribution of seats in 2018 at the same time. This is a proportional representation system. Notice that we have a very, very different setup. You've got a whole bunch of different colors that all represent different parties. All of these different parties are of different sizes. Some parties are relatively large, some are very, very small. The way you get to a distribution like this is through a proportional system where parties win seats according to the proportion of the vote that they received. Now, in Brazil, if you're a third party, you therefore stand a better chance of winning or getting some seats in Congress because the proportional representation system will assign seats according to the proportion of the vote that you receive. You don't have to win a plurality or a majority in every district the way you do in the US. They also have multi-member districts, which means that there's more than one member in each district. And so you have proportional representation, and you've got a system that is much more favorable to minorities. And in Brazil and in other Latin American countries, there are more minorities. There are smaller parties. There are many parties that are sub-national parties. They are regional or sort of provincial parties, if you will. In both Argentina and in Brazil, there are a number of parties that don't quite reach the level of being national parties. They don't compete at a national level for seats, but they can win seats in their districts. And because the system is a proportional representation system, it does protect minorities in minority and smaller parties. And so those parties can get seats in Brazil where they could not get seats in the US. And so Brazil looks very, very different than, say, the United States, where a majoritarian system produces a very, very majoritarian outcome, if you will. Now, the second choice that we have as constitution builders in this transitional democracy is the choice of political system. And this is a choice between the presidential or parliamentary political systems that we began this discussion referencing. Now, a parliamentary system increases power sharing in the executive because normally the prime minister and the president work together in a system that involves the president and a prime minister. If there's no president in addition to the prime minister, that prime minister's cabinet will increase power sharing because it will resemble the composition of the coalition assembled in the parliament that produced that prime minister. And so parliamentary systems increase power sharing because they sometimes have a president and a prime minister, and because the cabinet of the prime minister will resemble the composition of the coalition in the legislature. Now, a presidential system, on the other hand, has a one-person executive. And a one-person executive is by its very nature majoritarian in the election of that executive and in the designation of cabinet members and cabinet secretaries. Presidential systems concentrate power, whereas parliamentary systems tend to disperse power sort of among a wider range of groups. In general, parliamentary systems, for this reason, are more conducive to consociationalism and power sharing. And this is another reason that consociationalism has been relatively successful in Western Europe, because parliamentary systems are the main type of system in Western Europe. Presidential systems are hardly even relevant at all in Europe. The only one in Europe is Cyprus, and Cyprus is a small country that doesn't share much in common with other European countries. So the story of consociationalism's success in Europe has a lot to do with the use of parliamentary systems to increase power sharing in the executive. And this is a moment where I might ask you the same question. You know, would you rather live under a presidential system or a parliamentary system? And maybe we can field a couple responses via the chat, and we can wrap it up from there. But before we leave, does anyone want to just comment? Would you rather live in a presidential or a parliamentary system? Arturo says, if presidential, if it is my party that believes in science, if not parliamentary.
I'd rather live in a presidential system because it allows for checks on the government. Because if you're voting for a president, for example, you can split your ticket to vote for someone of the opposite party to sort of moderate the government. Whereas in a parliamentary system, that government is going to do the policies whether there's a minority that you voted for or not.
That's an interesting point. You can split the ticket. And that's one of the paradoxes of a parliamentary system. While it does help to increase power sharing because of the composition of the cabinet, it simultaneously concentrates power in that government because that prime minister and that cabinet are a product of a parliament, and we don't directly elect the prime minister. That selection takes place within the parliament itself, and we only vote for the parliament. And so that's one of the interesting sort of ironies of a parliamentary system. It both concentrates power, but also promotes power sharing. Very interesting. And in the choice between those two might come down to whether you'd like the ability to vote directly for both the executive and the legislature or not. And I think Ishan makes a compelling point with that. As a voter, you might want more control, right? Without a doubt. Evan says, I agree. I like how the president is separate from the legislature. Yeah, and there's a form of accountability that comes with that as well, horizontal accountability. We can use recall referendums and recall elections to vote out a president. We can use various powers of horizontal accountability in democracies to remove them. We vote for them directly, and so we don't have to depend on the legislature. Tyler says parliamentary system gives power to the people, especially valuable policymaking power to minorities, also allows more veto players, along with the district magnitude greater than 1. Touche. Good, Tyler. That's a very detailed and well put together response. It does give power to minorities. It allows more veto players within both the cabinet. It allows for district magnitude greater than 1. Good. Now, it's possible that we might have a parliamentary system where districts only have a single member. So, for instance, the UK is a parliamentary system where they use single member districts. And so it's not always the case that a parliamentary system has multi-member districts, but it often is the case that they do, because proportional representation tends to go hand in hand with parliamentary systems. John says, I actually like parliaments just because I don't like the executive to be separate. Yeah, maybe you want the legislature to elect the executive, and maybe you want the legislature to have control over the executive, in which case you want a parliamentary system. Okay, everybody, this was a very good discussion. We'll stop here, and we'll continue here on Wednesday. Thanks, everybody, for being here. I'll see you on Wednesday.